Welcome to the Progressive Primitivist podcast, where we believe that the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. One of the most interesting facts about Restoration history to me is that there were only two Civil War generals associated with the Restoration movement, one with the Union Army and one with the Confederate Army. Of course, the general associated with the Union Army was James A. Garfield, who went on to become President of the United States. But the general associated with the Confederate Army was Richard M. Gano. Now here's some interesting facts about Richard M. Gano. His great-grandfather immersed George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and his great-grandson was Howard Hughes, who of course at one time was the richest man in the world. This lecture about Generals Garfield and Gano is presented by Jerry Rushford. In my opinion, Jerry Rushford is the best person at telling Restoration history. Jake and I, whenever we would go every year to the Oklahoma Christian lectures, whenever Stafford North was directing them, we would hear Jerry Rushford, and Jerry Rushford was our favorite speaker. We think that you'll really enjoy this lecture.
It's an honor to be at Faulkner University. It's only my second time in Alabama. The full title of my class is behind me, Garfield and Gano. We're referring here to James Abram Garfield, who was a Civil War general in the North and the 20th President of the United States, and Richard Montgomery Gano, who was a general with the Confederate Army, was from Kentucky but spent the last 30 years in Dallas. Garfield and Gano, brothers in Christ, the dual biography of two Civil War generals. In my senior year at Oklahoma Christian, I wrote a 30-page research paper on James Garfield. I was fascinated that he was from our background, that he was from the Restoration movement, and I wanted to know more about him. I wrote it for William Jones, who was our professor of church history at Oklahoma Christian. I had fun doing it, and I thought I might want to know more about Garfield. Then I went off to Abilene Christian to work on my master's degree at ACU. And there I had a class called Biographies in the Restoration Movement by J.W. Roberts, in which he brought out a list of 100 people that had never been written on, and you could pick one of these 100 to write a major research paper. I was just at that point in my life as a student where I was cocky, and I thought I really knew this material. Oh, yeah, Restoration history. I got this down. Yeah. And I was sitting there thinking, I'll knock this paper off this weekend. Yeah. And he presented that list of 100 people, and there were only two I had ever heard of. And the only reason I'd heard of R.V. Glenn Freed is that I'd heard of Freed Hardeman in college. I didn't know anything about Freed. And there was one other one. We had a chapel there called Roberson Chapel. Charles Roberson had been the chairman of the Bible department. I only knew that because I took a class in Roberson Chapel. So I thought, well, I'll do Freed. It took me about 2 hours to find out there was nothing in Texas on Freed. I would have to go back to Henderson to get that. Well, I didn't want to do that. So I'll do Roberson. And his widow was still living, corner house across from Sewell Auditorium. I went over there. I'll have this thing done by the weekend. I knocked on Sister Robinson's door, and she didn't answer. And the neighbor came over, and he said, "Oh, she's not here." Well, where is she? Well, she went to visit her son. Well, where does he live? He lives up in Washington State. Well, do you reckon she'll be back? Well, it'll be about 6 months. Okay, so I'm not doing Roberson. I'm not doing Freed. I went back to J.W. Roberts and said, I'm embarrassed to say I've never heard of any of these people. And he started through, and when he got to John Allen Gano, G-A-N-O, great gospel preacher, he said his grandfather, John Gano, baptized George Washington in the Hudson River. I said, I don't think I've ever heard that story. I pulled out a $1 bill. I said, are you talking about this George Washington here with this nicely coiffed hair? He got dunked in the Hudson River? I don't think I read that before. He said, oh, yeah, it's on microcard downstairs. So I went down and looked, and this was quite a tradition that George Washington had been baptized. So I did a 30-page paper on John Allen Gano, loved it so much I kept going and did my master's thesis on Gano. Now fast forward that I'm in my PhD program at the University of California at Santa Barbara. I've got to decide on what I'm going to write my PhD dissertation on. I'm getting a degree in American church history. And I want to write a dual biography on Garfield and Gano. And I've got to convince my committee to let me do it. They never did. But I started in the summer of 1973. I had just married. We had just moved to Abilene. Lori was working for the Highland Church. Lori was a new Christian working in the response office. Isn't that great? Answering letters for people. And she would come home at night and say, "Do we believe this?" And so I left her working at Highland, and I said, I need to leave for a week. And I flew back to Nashville, got a motel room there at the Holiday Inn over there by DCHS, Disciples of Christ Historical Society, and went into work all week and to meet with the legendary Claude Spencer. Spencer was encyclopedic in his knowledge of Restoration history. And he was still very alert in 1973. He founded the Historical Society in 1941. And I said to him, I've come a long way to ask you what I think is a great question. How many generals did we have in the Restoration movement from the Civil War? How many of our people were elevated to the rank of general? And the great Claude Spencer said to me, "That's a great question. I've never thought of that." I said, "Oh, I can't believe that. Yeah. I thought of that early on. I know nothing about this movement. How many Civil War generals?" He said, "I've never thought of that. Give me a day or two." And he came back and said, I told him my theory. It's only these two. Yeah. And he came back and said, "I think you're right. It's Garfield from the north and Gano from the south." Now, there were others who said, no, there was Lew Wallace. So I looked into that. Lew Wallace's father was governor of Indiana. He was an elder in the church. He was a devout Christian man in Indianapolis. And Lew Wallace's stepmother, Zerelda Wallace, was well known in church events and well known by all the women in Indiana. She was a great leader among the women in the Restoration movement in Indiana. But there's no evidence at all that Lew Wallace was interested in church all through the Civil War, not until that night of September 19, 1876, when he was on the overnight train bound for Indianapolis, and he met Robert Ingersoll, the leading atheist of the day. Ingersoll was in his pajamas already in the sleeper car, and he came to meet with Wallace, and he challenged him to write a book that would expose Jesus of Nazareth as a fraud. And Wallace accepted the challenge, and he worked on it 4 years. But when the book came out in 1880, Ingersoll was disappointed. Wallace had written a book called Ben-Hur, a saga of the Christ. And obviously from that book you could see that Wallace was moving toward Christianity. Now, I don't know, I think he became a believer. He might have even gone to church with his father and stepmother some, but he wasn't connected with the Restoration movement. There's one other possibility. There was a man in Missouri, General Sterling Price, I think. His mother, his wife, I think, was a member of the church, and there might have been some other. But other than going to church with her on occasion, he wasn't a member, and he certainly didn't preach the way Garfield and Gano did. So, where did I get the idea for doing the dual biography? 2 years later, in 1975, Stephen Ambrose came out with Crazy Horse and Custer, The Parallel Lives of Two American Warriors. I was forever changed by that book, going back and forth, chapter and chapter, what they were like when they were 14, what they were like when they were 18, where they got their training, everything that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn when they faced off that day, and Crazy Horse won. Fascinating novel. Right after that, it was Statesman and Saint, Cardinal Wolsey and Sir Thomas More. Wolsey was the statesman, More was the saint, and they fought for favoritism with Henry VIII. Great book by Jasper Ridley. Then I read The Warrior and the Priest. The warrior was Teddy Roosevelt. The priest was Woodrow Wilson. They did not like each other, these men who were presidents of the United States. And John Milton Cooper wrote a great dual biography. And then The King and the Gentleman. The king was Charles I. The gentleman was Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Puritan movement. And this book goes up to when Cromwell wins and Charles is beheaded in 1649. I'm not sure Cromwell ultimately wins, because 11 years later, Charles II is brought back, the restoration of the monarchy and so on. Long term, Charles I might have won that one. And then the one I liked the best, The Lion and the Unicorn. The lion was Gladstone, William Ewart Gladstone, 4-time Prime Minister of England. And the sort of the poppycock unicorn was Benjamin Disraeli. And they both were Prime Ministers of England, back and forth, great titanic struggles. And finally, the one of David Lloyd George during World War I and Winston Churchill, World War II. They knew each other early on. They corresponded a lot, David and Winston. So I love dual biographies. So let's begin. Richard Gano was born in this house, which is still standing in Centerville, Kentucky, so named because it's halfway between Georgetown, Kentucky and Paris, Kentucky, right on the main road. And this is in the middle of a 500-acre bluegrass farm, gorgeous Georgian mansion. His father was John Allen Gano, the one wealthy preacher in the Church of Christ in Kentucky, because he married into wealth. Alexander Campbell had done that. John Allen thought this was a good idea. You marry the only daughter of a man who is a widower. And he will say to you, as Alexander learned when John Brown said, "Don't take my baby away from you. You can have the mansion, but you move in, but don't take my baby away." That happened to Gano when he married the only child of a man who was a widower. And so he inherited this beautiful home that he called Bellevue. And this was where Gano was born. And John Allen kept a diary, and this is what he wrote on June 18, 1830. "Another son was born unto us today, and we have named him Richard Montgomery Gano for his grandfather, General Richard Montgomery Gano of the War of 1812. And my earnest prayer to God is that he may live to become a useful man, and especially a noble Christian, and that he may become very useful to the Church of Christ and win many precious souls to Christ." June 18, 1830. Here's a black and white of that house before the addition was put on the other side. This is what it would have looked like when Richard lived at the house. And this is what it looked like after they put on the addition and painted it white. I actually tried to buy this house in 1971, or I tried to get Howard Hughes to buy it, so that it would become like not only a museum to the Gano family, but really a museum for the Restoration Movement. And not just the Restoration Movement, but the whole thoroughbred racing phenomenon of that part of Kentucky, because John Allen Gano imported thoroughbred horses into this farm at Bellevue. So this is Gano. He's born to wealth and to this lovely home. And this is Garfield. A little trivia for you. The last president born in a log cabin was James Abram Garfield. This is not the actual cabin, but an amazing replica of it. And so it gives you an understanding of where he starts life. Now I'll turn here real quickly and say that this is a crudely drawn map, but here at number 9 is where Garfield is born. And here at number 4 is where Gano is born. And here's where they both want to go to school. Now, when Mason and Dixon drew their surveyor's line, now follow this because this will be on the final exam in a few moments that I hand out. Mason and Dixon drew their line right across the bottom of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and they kept going right here, right to the Ohio River. And then they followed the river down past Cincinnati and Louisville and all the way down to St. Louis. That's the Mason-Dixon line. Trivia question: what part of what southern state is north of the Mason-Dixon line? Most of the people you ask that to will say, no part. The South was not north of the Mason-Dixon line. We fought a war over that. There was no part of the South, but there was the panhandle of what was then Virginia and now West Virginia. The panhandle is where Alexander Campbell settled, 30 miles from Pittsburgh. This is Bethany College, the central college for the movement. And both of these young men love Campbell, and they want to go to school there. Here's Campbell as he looked at that time period. Only Gano ends up going to school. Garfield went down there, spent a few days at the Campbell mansion, loved Thomas Campbell, talks a lot about Thomas, loved Alexander too, but it was a southern state. And he wrote in his diary, I don't much like the southern dandyism of this place. He never defines that, but I think I pretty much understand what a northern boy is not liking about that. Now we go to their wives. This is Gano's wife, Maddie Welch, a direct descendant of Barton Warren Stone. an attractive woman, and this is the only. I took an 8x10 of this when I interviewed the woman who got most of Howard Hughes' money when he died, Annette Loomis, and interviewed her, and I gave her this. And she wept because she had never seen a picture of her grandmother. And this is Lucretia Garfield, James Garfield's wife, an actual photograph by Matthew Brady, the famous Civil War photographer. Now, we could laugh at how the Victorians, dressed in these heavy... Well, I think I just lost the battery. Put that back in or I won't be able to point. We could laugh about how dark the clothing is and sort of the unusual hairstyles, but she's an attractive woman, and the jawline and her mouth and her nose and her hands. Brady comes down and has her fold her hands. So here's Lucretia Garfield. The wedding between Gano and Maddie Welch was happy from day one and was just a great marriage. 9 children that lived to adulthood. The marriage between James Garfield and Lucretia Rudolph was one of the worst marriages I've read anything about through the first 5 years of the marriage, and then became one of the great marriages in American history, and certainly among American presidents. And when he was assassinated, she lived for another 37 years. She never thought of remarrying, although she was asked a lot if she was going to remarry. She would always say, "I am the wife of General Garfield." And she spent all of her life sort of making sure his legacy was remembered. Now, when Garfield graduated from Williams College, he didn't study under Campbell. He went to Williams College to study under Mark Hopkins at Williamstown, Massachusetts. And he came home and at the age of 25 became president of Hiram College, which is still there in northeast Ohio. Garfield got a late start. He was baptized into Christ when he was 18. That seems late. I mean, Gano was baptized when he was 10, I think. He was born in 1830, baptized in 1840. I don't know if he had turned 11 yet. But Garfield gets a slow start. He goes to college late, and he starts preaching late. And he's 18 when he's baptized. But once he graduates, he becomes the youngest college president, and then the youngest state senator in Columbus, Ohio, and then the youngest man to try a case before the United States Supreme Court, and then the youngest member of the House of Representatives, and one of the youngest presidents in the history of the nation. Once Garfield gets up to speed, he moves quickly. But he never even celebrates his 50th birthday. He's assassinated at 49. But here he is as the president of Hiram. Now, Garfield, meanwhile, at the same time, Garfield is becoming president of Hiram. Gano is moving to Texas, and he didn't build this. It was there, but he purchased this house at Grapevine Prairie. It's not at Grapevine Prairie anymore because there's a runway there for the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. So it was brought into Dallas, drug in, and it's here in City Park in downtown Dallas, and there's a street leading into City Park called Gano Street, G-A-N-O. So I'm going back and forth. Are you with me here where Garfield has got off to a slow start, but now he's president of Hiram. Gano was in Kentucky, but now he has moved to Texas, and both of them ran for office in 1859. Garfield became the youngest state senator in Columbus, and Gano was one of the youngest members of the Texas House of Representatives in Austin. So when the Civil War started, there they were in a position to say, "No, let's not do this," or "Yes, count me in." Garfield was an immediate yes. He was handed a sheet of paper by Governor Dennison, who wrote at the top, "The 42nd Ohio. Here, go recruit 10 companies of 100. Get your 1,000 men. You're going to lead that battalion into war." Gano, on the other hand, in Austin, stood up and said, "We do not want to secede from the Union. We do not want this war. This is a mistake." But when everybody else was for it and wanted him to lead them, he was a leader. When I interviewed his granddaughter, she said he was 6'4". I've never been able to really prove that. That seems awfully tall. I suppose it's possible. I haven't seen any other reference to him being that tall in the 19th century. But he tried to stop members of the church from going to war, but when he could not, he agreed to lead them. And it's called in our history books Gano's Brigade, Gano's Garrison. There were 180. I've seen a lot of different numbers, but the number of men, all members of the Church of Christ, in Gano's Brigade was 180. Garfield recruited his first 100 of his 1,000 from the Hiram Church Christ. He went and stood behind the pulpit, and the same young men who had come down the aisle to obey the gospel and be baptized into Christ now came down the aisle to sign the muster roll and go to war with a man they trusted. And he got as his chaplain Uncle Harry Jones, who was the most popular preacher in the church. So parents were a little uneasy letting their sons go off to war, but after all, it was James Garfield, the president of the college, and Uncle Harry Jones who would preach to them on Sundays. And so the first 100, Company A, were from Hiram and the college. Here's a photograph of General Gano. Before he was a general, he's got his sword in his hand. I've always thought, I got this out of the Library of Congress, and of course his one eye is sort of just white. I've always thought that I could pay to have somebody professionally take his gray coat and remove all the darkness there and make this a little more attractive photograph, because it's a good one, and if I ever was to publish, I'd want to use it. Here's Company A of all members of the Church of Christ that fought with Garfield in the north. I don't have a picture of the Gano Brigade. Here's Garfield after he was made Brigadier General, and look at how tired his eyes are. He's only about 32 in this photograph, but war is hard. And he's got a hairline that's receding, and he just looks tired. He looks like he's lost weight. He weighed 200 pounds at one time. He's 6 foot tall. Now, here is the Civil War activities. Did you get that working? Still working on it. Here's the activities for Gano. Gano received word from his boyhood friend, Albert Sidney Johnston, bring your troops and meet me at Shiloh. We're engaging the enemy. And he was planning to hook up with Johnston here. In the meantime, Garfield is riding down to join Shiloh. The closest they ever came to trying to kill each other, these two gospel preachers, brothers in Christ, was at Shiloh Church, at Shiloh Battlefield. But then word came to Gano that Albert Sidney Johnston had been killed the day before, or 2 days before. And so Gano turns and comes across Alabama, across to hook up with Mississippi and Alabama, to hook up with John Hunt Morgan and become a part of Morgan's Raiders, the 7th Kentucky. And he fights here's all these battles with Morgan's Raiders, and we don't have time to go into the whole history of Gano and the war. Here is Garfield with his staff outside of a tent, actual photograph during Civil War days. And this is not a photograph. It looks like a pen and ink drawing of Gano with the dark beard. And now you see the eyes so much better than that photograph that I showed. So maybe if I could give somebody this picture and they could take the actual photograph and duplicate some of the facial features. Now here's the sites where Gano fought in Arkansas. And early in the war, when they were in camp right here on the Red River between Arkansas and Texas, that camp was called Camp Gano. I don't know if there's a historical marker there, but I'm pretty sure you could find that site. I think there is a historical marker. The closest Gano ever came to being killed in the Civil War was at Camden, between Camden and Poison Springs, when he was wounded and the person who had shot him was just getting ready to finish him off, and his son rode up and killed the other man. And so Gano actually fought in 72 battles. He said in his memoirs that they won 67 of the 72, but the closest he came to dying was at Camden, Arkansas. Garfield, on the other hand, was not in a lot of... when he got to Shiloh, the battle was over, and he rode through what was the largest slaughter on the North American continent up to that time, 24,000 corpses. And some people hadn't died yet. The moaning and the fires and the stench of flesh. And Garfield said later, something changed him right there. The horror of war. That scene never quite left him. I think he had seen himself on a great anti-slavery crusade, and then all of a sudden the horrors of 24,000 people lying dead around Shiloh Church. So there is Arkansas and Gano. And then in Indian Territory, the most famous battle for Gano was up at Cabin Creek when he and General Stan Waddy, who was the only Native American ever made a general in the Confederate Army, when they captured a Union wagon train of 300 wagons. And it was worth $1.5 million. It was quite a... And they did this in a battle at night with 2,000 troops. And when they captured it, Stan Waddy, the Indian leader, the general, led 3 cheers for Gano, 3 cheers for Gano. He was giving him all the credit at leading this big battle. It was after this battle that Jefferson Davis made him brigadier general in the Confederate Army. Now we're getting a sign there. What does that say?
There you go.
Now, what has been written, if you were interested in Garfield, The Wild Life of the Army, Civil War Letters of James A. Garfield, edited by Frederick Williams, who taught most of his career at Michigan State University in East Lansing. It was Williams who edited the 4 large volumes of Garfield's diary. I couldn't have written my PhD dissertation on Garfield without the diary. It is one of the largest and most impressive diaries ever written by an American president, and it was Williams who edited it, and it is worth everything it would cost you if you could find it. And this book, Richard M. Gano, physician, soldier, and clergyman, after he studied under Alexander Campbell, he went to Louisville Medical School, became a medical man. R.L. Roberts wrote that article in which he said of General Gano, he led his men through the week. He led them. And then he doctored their wounds when they were hurt in battle. And on Sundays, he preached to them. So he was the general, he was the physician, the soldier, the physician, and clergyman by Robert McLaurin, who is a descendant of Richard Gano. And he thanks me in his book because I helped him find some sources. Now, here is after the war, Gano decides he will lay down his sword. He doesn't want to be a soldier anymore. He wants to take up the sword of the Spirit, and he begins preaching. And this would take us a long time to go through all the preaching between 1866 and his last gospel meeting in 1906. But here is Georgetown, where his father was born. John Allen Gano is born there. He's buried there. This is Barton Stone's house, Georgetown, you know. And then as you come across, let's see. No, this is Georgetown, number 1. 4 is Centerville, where General Gano is born. And 8 is Paris. So Centerville is supposedly halfway between Georgetown and Paris, and then it's another 8 miles on to the Cane Ridge Meeting House. But Gano does most of his preaching in Bourbon, Scott, and Fayette counties. This is the heart of his preaching. But after 7 years, he preaches in a gospel meeting in Dallas, Texas, and he decides that he wants to move to Dallas. So what is Garfield doing after the war? He is the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs in the House of Representatives. He's not putting down his sword. He's the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee in 1867 to 69, and here he is with the other 8 committee members. But in fairness to Garfield, he goes to church every week. He preached a lot of Sundays from 1852 when he preached his first sermon until 1861 when the war started. Now, during the war, we know he preached here in Mooresville, Alabama. There used to be a sign there, didn't there, or not?
Still is.
And it's there. And the man who went out and got him and brought him in was probably Brother Hundley, J.H. Hundley, was it? And he went out. Can you picture that? Hundley probably said, we have nothing to do with this war, but there's Church Christ Meets over here in Mooresville, and we understand you're a preacher of the gospel, and if you'd be willing to come and preach for us Sunday, we'd love to have you. And what an invitation from an invading Union general. And Garfield goes to Mooresville and preaches, and then he also preached at Chattanooga. I think there's a sign on the Chattanooga one. Oh, it's Murfreesboro. That's right, above Chattanooga. So at least twice he preaches. Now, Gano preaches a lot during the war, too, but not up in the north. He's preaching in the south. So, it doesn't warrant a historical marker. Here's the church where Garfield attended in Washington, D.C. He and Jeremiah Sullivan Black arranged to purchase it. Sullivan Black was one of the great judicial minds, and Black was Democrat, Garfield was Republican. They bought this an old Methodist church, and they drug it over to Vermont Avenue. When Garfield was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, Guiteau thought of killing him in church, and he staked it out, and he went down and looked at the, I think the window that he was going to shoot in was this one, because he knew where Garfield sat every week, and the Sunday he went to shoot him was the one Sunday Garfield had gone to Baltimore, where he went to church in Baltimore, but he had gone to Baltimore for some political meeting, and so he ended up shooting him in the rail station at 9th and B. But this is the church building that after Garfield was elected president, the press laughingly referred to the Vermont Avenue Christian Church as the Campbellite Shanty. That's in several newspapers, the Campbellite Shanty. And even the man who drove the horse and carriage from the White House to church would let Garfield and his wife and his mother off at this church, but he asked General Gano, President Gano, is it okay if I go over and park the horses and the wagon in front of the Episcopal Church, which is much more attractive? And Garfield laughed and said, that would be fine, just don't be late getting back here. I can't be standing out here on the curb or whatever. That was the agreement. He didn't want to park in front of the Campbellite Shanty. Here's Garfield's house in Washington, D.C. at the corner, I think it's the northeast corner of 13th and I. There are a lot of accounts of people who went to visit the Garfields here, and they all talk about how many books he had. There were books stacked up in every room in the house, even in the bathroom. There were books stacked up there, and he was a very well-read man. He's the only president I know that was on the board of the Smithsonian Institute. I mean, he knew all the literary figures of the day. And he just had a literary bent. Now, you would think this house has been preserved by the various historians in our government, but this was torn down in 1964, but for a good cause, to make another parking lot in Washington, D.C. So there's a parking lot over this spot where many famous Americans came to get Garfield's counsel in the years that in the 1870s before he became president in 1880. Now, here's General Gano's preaching in Texas. This would take a week to describe all this, so I won't do it, other than to say that up here you've got Dallas-Fort Worth, so that's home. But here, he was a land surveyor with his sons for the railroad. He worked for the railroad. And rather than accept money, he accepted land. And so he built the G4 Ranch, and there's the size of it on the Rio Grande River. I mean, here's Mexico. Here's the Rio Grande River. That's 55,000 acres. You're not surprised that some accounts have said he died a millionaire in 1913. 55,000 acres. He had 30,000 head of cattle roaming around those 50,000 acres in the Big Bend. This is the Rio Grande River and the Big Bend section, the G4 Ranch, because I think it was Garfield and his three sons, G4, the four Ganos, and Presidio County. Now, when he went to Dallas, the first church building, not the one that became Pearl and Bryant. This was not at Pearl and Bryant. But this is the Church Christ where Garfield becomes an elder as soon as he moves there in 1873 and serves as an elder for 30 years until he dies in 40 years. 40 years in Dallas, 1873 till he died in 1913. And I forgot what street this is on, but I've got it in my notes somewhere. This is the house that Garfield buys up by Cleveland, Ohio in Mentor. It's still there. You need to go tour it. It's worth a tour. And I take a lot of kidding for the fact that I took my wife on our honeymoon to this house. And because we were married in Michigan, and our honeymoon was driving to Texas, where she was going to work and I was going to work on my PhD. And we not only toured this house, but we went to Hiram, Ohio, just a short distance away, and toured the house where Garfield lived in Hiram for many years. And Phoebe Zimmerman is still living. And the man who will give you the tour here is Mark Lombardi, who's a leader in the Church of Christ. He's married to Terry Gardner's sister. Some of you know Terry Gardner, a great church historian. And he's married to Terry's sister, Mark Lombardi, who is the police chief of Hiram, Ohio, or was. But now he's working here at the house giving tours. But he went to see Phoebe Zimmerman because he came out to the Pepperdine lectures and he saw me. And I went back to see him and he said, Phoebe, do you remember that Jerry Rushford years ago? She said, yes, the one who brought his bride here on her honeymoon. And 30 years later, close to 40 years later, she still remembered this. And so I'm famous to Phoebe Zimmerman in Hiram, Ohio. But when you go do your tour here, ask if Mark Lombardi is working that day. Now, almost the same architectural design is the Gano mansion. I got this out of an old paper, the Dallas Journal, Dallas Mansions of Other Days. The home of the late General R.M. Gano was built about 1880. Now, so he moves into this house in 1880. Garfield bought Minter Farm, the house I just showed you, in 1877. So you see the parallels between these two men. Garfield's going to run for president in 1880, and Gano is being pushed to run for governor of Texas. He chooses not to, but he was that popular. An ex-general in the Confederate Army and a gospel preacher. I've read different accounts that said he could have won easily if he had wanted to be governor of Texas. So their lives continue to be parallel. Boy, I'm having to punch this about 6 times every time to get it to move. There we go. Here's another photo from the 20th century of the house. This is at the corner of Haskell and Gaston, if you're in Dallas, Texas, the old Gano mansion.
Still there?
Yeah, I think it's still standing. Here's a photograph of Garfield after he became president. I like this one from behind and from the side. Sort of looks like Paul Newman as he looked at a certain point in his acting career. I always thought Newman maybe could play Garfield, but Newman was quite short, 5'6". You know, Garfield was 6 foot, 200 pounds. But Newman had that kind of profile. Here is Garfield watching the parade at his inauguration. At first I thought he was giving his inaugural address, and then I thought, boy, nobody's interested in it here. Look at this. They've all turned their back on the speaker, and they're looking out here. He's not giving his inaugural address. He is watching the presidential parade. And let me see if I can identify. This is Rutherford B. Hayes, the outgoing president. Here's Garfield speaking. This is Lucy Hayes, Lemonade Lucy, who banned liquor from the White House. And here's Garfield's wife, Lucretia. And way over here is his elderly mother. You know, the first thing Garfield did when he put his hand on that Bible and took the oath of office, this had never happened in American history, turned and kissed his mother. First time a president had ever turned to kiss his mother, because Garfield was only 49 and his mother lived to be a long old age, and she was there to watch her son sworn in. This looks very Victorian, doesn't it? The banners and... Here's the president's family, a sketch during their brief stay in the White House. Garfield had they had 7 children, but 5 lived to maturity. The oldest boy, Harry, went to Williams College like his father did in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And then he was teaching at Princeton, political science. And then Williams called him to be their president in 1907. He went back in the fall of 1907 to become the president. His best friend on the faculty, Henry Van Dyke, famous Presbyterian minister and professor of English literature, Van Dyke said, "Don't go. Tell him you're not available. I don't want you to leave Princeton." And Harry said, "No, I've got to go. My alma mater's calling. But why don't you come this fall and preach Christ for a week in the chapel?" That's not going to happen today at Williams College, one of the more secular schools in America. But it happened in 1907, and Van Dyke came. And I was there recently at the house, the guest quarters on the second floor looking west. He was there on the second floor looking at the Berkshire Mountains in October. You know, New England is just beautiful in October, and he throws open the drapes, and he said that before he knew what he was doing, he was humming Beethoven's Hymn to Joy. And he said to himself, what a shame that Christians don't have words to sing, we could sing this great music by day. And he took a sheet of paper and he wrote, "Joyful, joyful, we adore," you know the hymn. "Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, Lord of God of glory, God," I forget how it goes. And he comes down the next morning, he puts the finishing touches on, he descends the staircase, and he says to Harry Garfield, who's probably in there scrambling the eggs and getting breakfast ready, and he says something like, "Here, I wrote a hymn last night in your house." "You did what?" "I wrote a hymn last night in your house. It must always be sung to Beethoven's Ninth." And he sat down and consumed a large breakfast. What do I know? It makes for a great story there on the breakfast. But he did write the hymn in Garfield's house. And this is the family picture. Now, Garfield is assassinated 4 months into office. He takes office March 4. What was the first thing he did on March 4? Even before he took the oath of office, he hosted at breakfast in the White House Harrison Rhodes and Burke Hinsdale, his two best friends in the church from the day when they were students together at Hiram College, and when they were his major right arm, left arm lieutenants when he was president of Hiram College. And in those days when he was running for state senator, they dreamed of this day. They talked about Garfield going all the way to the White House someday. And they laughed about it. And he said, "When that happens, you'll be the first ones to come eat with me." And it happened. And he goes to become president. And Burke Hinsdale and Harrison Rhodes come and have breakfast before Garfield goes to take the oath of office. And then he is shot by Charles Guiteau, mentally deranged French-Canadian, wanted to be ambassador to France, wasn't qualified. In those days, the president sat there all day long while thousands of people came by telling him what job they wanted. And this was before the Pendleton Act. And the president had to make all these choices. And the president was just exhausted. He couldn't do anything else but appoint people to office. So Guiteau felt like he had to kill him. And he did shoot him at 9th and B at the railway station. Now, the Smithsonian is there now, one of the Smithsonian buildings. And I walked in and I measured that out. And I called one of the guards over. I apologize for this. This is pure Rushford here. I'm a trivia buff, and that's who I am. I called the guy over and I said, "Did there used to be a historical marker right in here somewhere?" And he said, "I don't know. To what?" I said, "We've only had 4 presidents assassinated, sir, and the other 3 locations are pretty well documented. And by my figuring, Garfield had to have been shot. Where were the he had to have been shot right about here." And that guy said, "You're right. I forgot about that marker. It was here when I first came here years ago. They must have renovated this part of the building and cleaned it, and it's down in a basement somewhere, or it's over in a closet." And I said, "Don't you think it ought to be out?" "I do. Very good point. That you're documenting a president of the United States was shot right here, assassinated, and there was once a marker, and it's not there anymore. But I prided myself that I came within about 20 feet of where that had to have taken place, and the guy remembered that there was a marker. I should have written his name down and made him sign my program or something." That
Did you go find the marker?
No, yeah, let's go find it. Here's the White House draped in black bunting. I didn't see this when Lincoln was assassinated. I didn't see it for McKinley or Kennedy. But here at Garfield, the White House is in mourning after the assassination. Garfield is buried in a large palace kind of building in Lakeview Cemetery overlooking Lake Erie. And he was born in a log cabin, the last president, and buried in this enormous, you can't tell from this photograph how big that is. It says burial place of James A. Garfield, 20th President of the United States. Now, this is picky of me, picky, but he wasn't born on November 18th. He was born on November 19th. So how can you make errors like that? At the burial place of an American president, he died on September 19, and this was dedicated in 1890. This is what it looked like after years and years of turning dark, and they just began to clean it when this photo was done. I think by now it may be done. I haven't Googled a new photo of the Garfield Monument, but I assume it's all cleaned off now and is beige colored. And then all the money flowed in to build a new church building, which they did, the Vermont Avenue Christian Church. The press called it the Garfield Memorial Church. It was never called that. That was an embarrassment to Garfield, and and an embarrassment to his family. But this building is still standing. It's not, I forgot what kind of church meets there now. The old Christian church now is called Capitol City Christian Church, Capitol Hill Christian Church, and it's not far away, just around the corner where Lyndon Johnson went. And then they built this college to Garfield out in Wichita, Kansas in 1886, and it lasted 4 school years, 86, 87, 87, 88, 88, 89. One year it got up to 1,620 students. That was, at one point, that was about the size of Oklahoma Christian and Lubbock Christian. They're bigger now, but, I mean, that's not a small school, 1,620, but the crops failed. Kansas is, is an agrarian society. The church didn't have the money to keep it open. It lay fallow, empty for 8 years. The Quakers came along and bought it and renamed it Friends University, and it's still there to this day. But as you go up this stairwell and you see the sign of the old building, it says Friends University, but as you come up these stairwells, and then that building I showed you is just the front. It's a T, and that's the crossing of the T. The building goes way back, and that includes the auditorium where they had chapel. And then the sign says, this property has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places, Garfield University. They say 1887. The school year started in the fall of 86. And now Friends University taking it over in 1898. The state of Kansas honors the memory of James A. Garfield, the student, teacher, Christian, statesman, patriot, soldier, and martyred president. And then the great quote from the night Lincoln was assassinated and before they knew he had died in New York City when the riot was about to break out around 42nd Street there at Times Square. And Garfield came out on the balcony. He was staying in New York, and he came out on the balcony, and he was 34 years old with this 6 foot, 200 pound, this barrel-chested voice that had been used to preaching. This booming voice, he calmed the audience. He calmed the people who recognized he was a politician of some sort. From Ohio, I think, yeah. And he was calming the crowd, and at the end of his speech, he gave the great line, God reigns, and the government at Washington still lives. And the crowd calmed down and cheered that it was going to be okay. But, of course, Lincoln was dying and was affirmed as dead the next morning. Gano moves to Texas. Here he is, growing old gracefully with the white beard. He becomes an elder here at Pearl and Bryan. There's the 4 pillars on the Pearl and Bryan Church. This is my favorite photo of Gano in his Edwardian coat, taken, I think, in 1906. His oldest boy, William Beriah Gano, graduate of Harvard Law School, president of the bar in Dallas. It was William B. Gano who wrote the charter that launched 3 Christian colleges: Childers Classical Institute, today called Abilene Christian University, Gunter Bible School, no longer in existence, and Southwestern Christian College, not the one we have today in Terrell, but the one that was in Denton, Texas, north. He was chairman of the board of that. He wrote those charters with Jesse P. Sewell. Jesse P. Sewell told me that on June 4, 1966, in an interview at his home in Abilene, Texas, that he and W.B. William Beriah Gano wrote those charters to launch those Christian schools. And this was his daughter, Aline. W.B. Gano had married Jeanette Grissom. She was a direct descendant of Barton Stone. And so they named their daughter Aline. They named her Aline Stone Gano, and she becomes the mother of Howard Hughes. So Howard Hughes, at one time the wealthiest man in America, has these deep roots in Churches of Christ where he is a direct descendant of Barton Stone and John Allen Gano. And here's Gano's tombstone in Oakland Cemetery, with his wife and some of their children. Here he is toward the end of his life, and he had the 3 boys who were the Gano. This is William B., this is Maurice, and this is Lee. The Gano, and Gano law firm, and both of these, W.B. and Maurice, became judges. In fact, Maurice was the featured speaker at the Abilene Christian Lectures in 1919. And here's the picture out of the book. I just took it out of the ACC Bible Lectureship book. He was Judge Gano, and his lecture was The Inspiration of the Bible. That was the main lecture. The Inspiration of the Bible, Judge Gano, 1919, up at Abilene Christian. And this, the last slide, is Pearl and Brian. You can see the Church of Christ sign sort of here at the side. This became the mother church. Today, this congregation is called Highland Oaks in Dallas. Big congregation. But this was Pearl and Brian at that corner, and Gano was an elder there 30 years, and his son, W.B. Gano, was one of the great leaders there. And so I'll close with this. We're out of time. Here's my last comment. When you spend as much time as I've spent with Garfield and Gano, you get fond of both men, and I am. I feel like I walked with them. I know them well. But I am interested in this. As devout as Garfield was, he was not able to pass along his love for the Restoration Movement to his children. Not that they didn't go to church somewhere, and not that they did not live Christian moral lives. I think they did. But any love to be a part of the Campbell Stone movement, the Restoration Movement, that didn't pass on a generation. On the other hand, Gano baptized all 9 of his children, and all 9 were faithful to the church. And the last connection with the Churches of Christ and the Gano family would be when Maurice died in 1927, because he was a bachelor and he had no children. W.B. Gano died in 1913 in a train accident, same year as his father, General Gano. So Howard Hughes, the 2 main male figures in his life, his grandfather and his great-grandfather, both died when he was 8 years old. And he never had really any strong leadership at all. But the last connection was Maurice Gano, who died in 1927. So that's a dual biography, more than you probably wanted to know today, about Garfield and Gano, the only 2 generals we had from the Restoration Movement. And they fought, one in the north, one in the south, came very close to meeting each other in battle at Shiloh Church, managed to not do that, but served so valiantly that both of their leaders made them generals in their army. And when Garfield was made general, he had a letter from Lincoln who said, I order you to come home and take your seat in the 32nd Congress, because while Garfield was at war, his friends back home put his name up. He didn't have to campaign. He was famous, and he won election to the United States House of Representatives from that district in Northeast. It was the first of 11 elections he won right up to the presidency. He never lost. He was 11 and 0 in political races. And Lincoln said, I have a greater need of a safe Republican vote in Congress than I do of another general kicking around in Georgia. Get back here to Washington, D.C. and help me pass some legislation. So Garfield comes back, and his first day in the Capitol wears his Major General uniform. You know, just to let everybody know, I want you to know who I am here. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a comer. And I want you to know, and at 32, he comes in there. He just did it that first day to sort of let everybody know a new congressman has arrived. Well, we're about to have Cecil May teach for us in about 8 minutes on, who's he teaching on?
Brewer.
G.C. Brewer. You've got 8 minutes to run, use the bathroom, or shake hands with somebody. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed being with you today.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Alright, I hope everyone has a great day.